It was a typical spring afternoon in 1978 when a logging crew began a routine day of work near the rugged slopes of Holcomb Peak in Josephine County, Oregon. They expected nothing more than the rhythmic sounds of machinery and the scent of fresh-cut timber. But what they found beneath the dense canopy of the Pacific Northwest wilderness would change the history of the region forever. Hidden in plain sight for 4 years, a secret was about to be unmasked, one that proved the most enduring mysteries are often those that wait silently in the shadows of the forest. Tonight, we look into the quiet echoes of a journey that began in the Big Sky country of Montana and ended on a lonely ridge in Oregon. A journey that took over half a century to finally reach its destination. The air in the high country of Oregon is often heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a sensory blanket that seems to muffle the passage of time. In 1974, a 19-year-old young man named Mark Smith decided it was time to see what lay beyond the horizon of his home in Billings, Montana. He was at that age where the world feels vast and full of unspoken promises, a time when the road ahead seems to stretch out into an infinite series of possibilities. Mark was a young man with his whole life in front of him, a brother, a son, and a friend who simply wanted to experience the world on his own terms. The last tangible memory his family would hold on to for the next 50 years was a photograph taken in September 1973. In that picture, Mark is standing at his sister's wedding. It is a moment frozen in time, capturing the soft light of a Montana autumn and the genuine smile of a young man who had no way of knowing it would be the last image his loved ones would ever have of him. He looks happy, perhaps a bit restless, standing among his siblings in the kind of celebratory atmosphere that defines a family's history. When he left Billings shortly after that wedding to begin his travels, his family expected to hear from him soon. They expected postcards from distant towns, phone calls from noisy stations, and eventually, a dusty backpack appearing on the front porch. But as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the silence from Mark became a heavy, permanent fixture in their lives. For the Smith family, the world continued its frantic pace, but they lived in a quiet uncertainty that few can truly imagine. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly or a car slowed down in front of the house, there was that momentary flash of hope. The possibility that Mark had finally decided to come home. His siblings grew up, started families of their own, and moved through the decades, but they never stopped thinking of their brother. He was the missing piece of their family puzzle, a ghost who walked beside them through every holiday and every milestone. They would later say that not a single day went by where his name wasn't whispered in their thoughts, or his face didn't appear in their dreams. While the family waited in Montana, the woods of southern Oregon were harboring a secret. On May 9th, 1978, those loggers near Holcomb Peak stumbled upon a sight that stopped them in their tracks. Resting on the forest floor, partially obscured by years of needles and debris, were a human skull and a shoulder blade. Nearby, the remnants of a brown sweater and a simple shirt lay tangled in the undergrowth, the fabric weathered by the harsh Oregon winters and the relentless passage of the seasons. It was a discovery that brought the local authorities deep into the wilderness, into a landscape where the terrain is unforgiving and the trails are narrow. At the time, forensic science was in its infancy compared to the tools we have today. The remains were collected with care, but the limitations of the era would lead to a mistake that would stall the search for the truth for more than 40 years. An odontologist and a pathologist examined the partial skeleton, trying to piece together the identity of the person who had met their end on that lonely peak. Based on the skeletal markers available to them in the late 70s, they made a formal determination. The remains belonged to a young female, likely between the ages of 16 and 18. With that single identification, the Holcomb Peak Doe was born. She became a cold case file, a box in a storage room, and a nameless tragedy in the records of Josephine County. Because investigators were looking for a missing girl, the name Mark Smith never crossed their desks. He was a young man from Montana, hundreds of miles away, and the gender discrepancy created a wall that seemed impossible to scale. As the decades drifted by, the case of the Holcomb Peak Doe grew cold. The box containing the skull and the scapula sat on a shelf, gathered dust, and moved between facilities as offices were remodeled and records were digitized. To the world, the person on the mountain had become a statistic, a footnote in the history of Oregon's unidentified remains. But to a family in Montana, the person they loved was still just gone. They didn't know about the discovery in Oregon. They didn't know that their brother's remains were sitting in a box, mislabeled and forgotten. They only knew the void he had left behind. It is fascinating to think about how close the truth was for all those years, hidden only by the narrow margins of early forensic technology. The evidence was there, resting in a quiet room, waiting for science to catch up with the mystery. It wasn't until 2020 that the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office decided to take another look at the Holcomb Peak case. With the advent of advanced DNA sequencing, they realized they had an opportunity to finally give the girl on the mountain her name back. But when the results came in, they provided the first major shock in 40 years. The remains were not female. The Holcomb Peak Doe was, and had always been, male. This revelation changed everything. It was the but moment that reopened a door that had been slammed shut in 1978. Suddenly, investigators weren't looking for a missing daughter. They were looking for a son. They began a partnership with DNA Labs International, working meticulously to build a genetic profile from the weathered bone fragments. This process is slow and requires a level of precision that feels almost like a rhythmic, scientific meditation. They were looking for a needle in a global haystack, hoping that somewhere in the vast databases of human history, there was a match waiting to be found. As you settle in tonight, I invite you to think about the vastness of that search. Imagine the investigators looking through records of thousands of missing men, trying to find one who fit the timeline and the location. For several more years, the profile remained unmatched, a digital ghost waiting for a connection. Then, in September 2025, the final piece of the puzzle was uploaded. A new DNA kit from a private citizen entered the database, and the algorithms began to hum. A link was established. A family line was identified. The trail led directly to the Smith family in Billings. When investigators finally made the call to Mark's siblings, it was a moment 52 years in the making. The brothers and sisters, now much older than the 19-year-old Mark they remembered, listened as the voice on the other end of the line spoke of a ridge in Oregon and a discovery made in 1978. They confirmed that Mark had left in 1974 and had never returned. They provided their own DNA to bridge the final gap, and on February 26, 2026, the identification was made official. Mark Smith was no longer a doe. He was a person again. As we begin this journey tonight, exploring the long highway that led Mark to Holcomb Peak, I want to welcome you. If you are still awake and listening, I'd love to know where you're settling in from and what the night feels like outside your window. We are glad you are here to help us honor the memory of a young man who was lost for a long time, but who is finally being told his way home. Let us move on to the details of that journey, the life he left behind, and the quiet resolution that finally brought peace to a Montana family after half a century of silence. In September 1973, a 19-year-old named Mark Smith stood before a camera at his sister's wedding in Billings, Montana, adjusted his suit, and smiled, a moment of frozen time that would become the only bridge left for a family waiting 52 years for him to come home. In that photograph, the world looks bright, filtered through the warm, grainy lens of the early 70s. Mark was a young man with his entire life stretching out before him, like the open highways he so desperately wanted to explore. He had a sense of wanderlust that was common for his generation, a desire to see what lay beyond the horizon of Big Sky Country. But when he eventually packed his bags and stepped away from that familiar Montana landscape in 1974, he unknowingly stepped into a silence that would last for generations. For half a century, his siblings lived in what can only be described as the silent middle. It is a specific kind of purgatory, the hollow space between hope and grief where the clock never truly stops ticking, but the hands never seem to move. Every holiday, every birthday, and every milestone for the Smith family was shadowed by a chair that remained empty and a question that remained unasked because the answer felt too heavy to carry. They lived their lives, they grew older, and they moved houses, but they always kept a small part of themselves anchored to 1974. Waiting for a phone call or a knock at the door that never came. They didn't know that for most of those 52 years, the answer to their heartache was sitting in a cardboard box 800 miles away in Oregon, mislabeled and largely forgotten by a system that had made a fundamental mistake. The story of Mark Smith is not just a mystery of a missing person. It is a story of how a single forensic error in 1978 created a wall of static that muffled the truth for 42 years. When a logging crew working the rugged, timber-heavy slopes near Holcomb Peak in Josephine County stumbled upon human remains in the late 70s, the gears of justice began to turn, but they were grinding in the wrong direction. At the time, the tools of the trade were limited by the era's biological understanding. A skull and a scapula, found resting near the remnants of a brown sweater, were laid out on a cold examination table. Based on the skeletal maturation and dental records available at the time, an odontologist and a pathologist made a definitive declaration. These were the remains of a young female, likely between 16 and 18 years old. With that one stroke of a pen, Mark Smith was effectively erased from the search. Investigators in Oregon were looking for a missing girl, while a family in Montana was looking for their brother. The two paths, which should have intersected, were pulled apart by a clinical error that would take decades of scientific advancement to correct. It is haunting to think of that box sitting on a shelf, designated as the Holcomb Peak Doe, while Mark's siblings looked at his wedding photo and wondered where in the world he could be. Why did a 19-year-old boy from the plains of Montana end up on a rugged, isolated peak in the Oregon wilderness? What drew him to those woods? And how did he find himself in a place so remote that it took 4 years for his remains to be spotted by a passing crew? Tonight, as the rhythmic ticking of the clock reminds us of the steady passage of time, we are going to unravel the threads of this half-century mystery. We will look into the gaps of the investigation, the moment the DNA finally spoke a different truth in 2020, and how, in September 2025, a single genetic genealogy match in a public database finally brought a name to a soul that had been lost to the silence for 52 years. Mark Smith's journey home is a story of how a family never forgot, how a sister's wedding photo was the only thing that remained, and how, in early 2026, the truth finally brought a long-awaited resolution to the quiet, rugged peaks of the Pacific Northwest. Let us begin our look into the last photograph. The year was 1974, and in Billings, Montana, the air often carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant rhythmic hum of the Northern Pacific Railway. For 19-year-old Mark Smith, that sound wasn't just background noise. It was a heartbeat, a constant reminder that the world stretched far beyond the rim rocks that ringed his hometown. To understand why Mark stepped onto the highway that year, you have to understand the era he was living in. It was a time of wandering. The early 70s had cultivated a specific kind of American restlessness, a cultural wanderlust where young men felt a magnetic pull toward the horizon. They weren't necessarily running away from anything. They were running toward the unknown, often with nothing more than a sturdy backpack, a few dollars, and the invincible confidence that only comes with being 19. In the quiet streets of Billings, Mark's life was defined by the kind of small-town normalcy that felt infinite at the time. He lived in a house where the screen door likely slapped against the frame, and where his mother, a woman who would later spend decades waiting for a sound she'd never hear again, kept a kitchen filled with the familiar sights and sounds of a large, busy family. Mark was a young man of his time, caught between the traditions of a Montana childhood and the expanding possibilities of a world that felt more accessible than ever. His siblings remember him not just as a brother, but as a person with a quiet sense of curiosity. They didn't know, as they sat around the table or walked together in the cool Montana evenings, that the clock was already ticking toward a silence that would last for over 50 years. The most enduring image of Mark, the one that would become a sacred artifact in the Smith household, was captured in September 1973. It was his sister's wedding day. The air that afternoon would have been crisp, carrying that specific autumn chill that rolls off the mountains and into the valleys. Mark was dressed in the formal attire of the era, looking every bit the young man standing on the threshold of adulthood. There is a specific kind of light in that photograph, a softness that only vintage film seems to capture. And in it, Mark looks back at the camera with the expression that feels, in hindsight, almost like a secret. He spent that day moving through the crowd of family and friends, talking with his siblings about the future. There were conversations that felt mundane at the time, plans for the next week, jokes about the wedding cake, and the kind of light-hearted banter that defines a close-knit family. No one knew it was a final goodbye. They didn't know that the clothes he wore that day, or the way he laughed at a relative's joke, would be the last physical impressions he would leave on their world. When he finally made the decision to leave Montana in 1974, it wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a simple departure, the kind thousands of young men were making as they hitched rides or hopped buses toward the coast. He left with the confidence of youth, stepping onto the highway toward a horizon that promised everything, leaving behind a Montana sky that would never see him again. For his family, the reality of his absence didn't set in all at once. At first, it was just the expected silence of a traveler. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, that silence began to take on a physical weight. It settled into the corners of his childhood bedroom, a room his mother refused to change. She kept his things exactly where they were, his clothes, his books, the small remnants of a 19-year-old's life, as if changing the space would be an admission that he wasn't coming back. This lingering silence is something many families of the missing describe, a suspended state of grief where you cannot move forward because there is no ground to stand on. Every time the phone rang or a car pulled into the drive unexpectedly, a flash of hope would ignite, only to be extinguished by the familiar, heavy quiet of another day without him. Mark's siblings grew up, married, and had children of their own, but the memory of their brother remained a constant, quiet presence in their lives. They would look at that wedding photo from 1973 and wonder where he was, if he had found the adventure he was looking for, or if he had simply started a new life somewhere far away, perhaps under a different name. The human mind is incredibly adept at creating scenarios to protect itself from the unthinkable. They imagined him in California, or perhaps living a quiet life in the woods of Washington. But while Mark was traveling west, a logging crew in the Oregon wilderness was about to stumble upon a mystery that would defy the experts for generations. The transition from the warm, nostalgic memories of a Montana wedding to the cold, rugged reality of the Oregon timberlands was a journey Mark took alone, and it would take half a century for the rest of the world to catch up to him. The morning of May 9th, 1978 in Josephine County, Oregon, began like any other for the local logging crew assigned to the slopes of Holcomb Peak. This part of the Pacific Northwest is defined by its verticality, rugged, unforgiving terrain where the Douglas firs grow so thick they seem to swallow the light even at high noon. The air that morning was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles, a familiar backdrop for men whose lives were measured in timber and sweat. The rhythmic thud of axes and the mechanical whine of saws filled the air, a productive symphony of industry in the heart of the wilderness. But as the crew moved through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth, the workday took a sudden, jarring turn. One of the loggers, navigating a steep incline covered in moss and decaying leaves, spotted something pale nestled against the dark soil. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a weathered river stone, perhaps unearthed by the shifting of the heavy Oregon snows from the previous winter. He reached down to move it, his gloved hand brushing aside the ferns, but as his fingers made contact, the weight and texture were instantly wrong. The logger reached for what he thought was a stone, only to find the cold, smooth surface of a human skull looking back at him from the forest floor. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sudden, sharp chirp of a startled bird in the canopy above. The machinery was silenced as the crew gathered around the small, hollow-eyed shape that had been hiding in the shadows for 4 long years. It was a moment of profound contrast. The vitality of a crew at work suddenly confronted by the absolute stillness of a life long since ended. As they looked closer, they realized this wasn't an intact burial. The forest had claimed much of the traveler. Aside from the skull, the only other significant remain was a single scapula, a shoulder blade, lying several feet away in the brush. Resting near the bones were the weathered remnants of a life once lived. They found a fragment of a brown sweater, its knit fibers now brittle and grayed by the relentless cycle of Oregon's seasons. Beneath it were the tattered remains of a shirt, so degraded by 4 winters of snow and rain that it seemed more like a part of the earth than a garment. There was no wallet, no identification, and no sign of the rest of the skeleton. It was as if the mountain had chosen to reveal only these 2 pieces of the puzzle, leaving the rest of the story buried beneath the roots and the stones of Holcomb Peak. The location was remote, far from the established hiking trails, which immediately raised questions that the local authorities would struggle to answer. How had a young man ended up so far off the beaten path? The terrain around Holcomb Peak is deceptive. What looks like a manageable ridge can quickly turn into a labyrinth of steep drop-offs and impenetrable thickets. For a traveler from the flat expanses of Montana, the verticality of Josephine County would have been a beautiful but deadly trap. Investigators who arrived on the scene began to process the area with a sense of grim determination. They noted the lack of personal belongings, a detail that created an immediate information gap. No keys, no coins, no sturdy hiking boots nearby to suggest a prepared trekker. There was a lingering sense of dread as they combed the surrounding area, but the vastness of the Oregon wilderness seemed to hold its secrets tight. The mystery of the alibi loop began here, the confusing reality of why only 2 bones remained. Had animals scattered the rest? Or had the elements simply reclaimed the body with such efficiency that only the hardest parts survived to be found by the logging crew? As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the discovery site, the team carefully packed the remains into evidence bags. They felt the weight of the responsibility. This was someone's son, someone's brother, who had been missing for years while life continued in the valleys below. The authorities arrived, confident they could give this person their name back within a matter of weeks. Instead, They were about to make a forensic mistake that would last 4 decades, leaving Mark Smith's family to wait in a silence that would stretch into a new century. The forensic process in 1978 was a far cry from the high-resolution digital modeling and genetic sequencing we take for granted today. When the remains from Holcomb Peak arrived at the examiner's office, the science was rooted in physical observation and manual measurements. The tools of the trade were calipers, magnifying glasses, and the subjective expertise of the human eye. An odontologist and a pathologist were assigned to the case, tasked with reading the story written in the calcium and enamel of the partial skeleton. They looked at the development of the wisdom teeth and the cranial sutures, trying to estimate an age and a biological profile. After a series of examinations, they reached a definitive conclusion that would set the course of this investigation for the next 42 years. They officially declared that the remains belonged to a young female, likely between 16 and 18 years old. This was not a moment of malice or laziness, but rather a reflection of the profound limitations of 1970s forensic technology. In those days, determining the sex of skeletal remains relied heavily on the pelvis, which is the most sexually dimorphic part of the human frame. However, the logging crew had only recovered a skull and a scapula. Without the pelvic girdle to examine, the scientists had to rely on vague indicators in the skull. The prominence of the brow ridge, the shape of the jawline, and the texture of the bone. In a young man of 19, like Mark Smith, these masculine features are often not yet fully developed, leading to a biological ambiguity that was frequently misinterpreted by even the most seasoned experts of the era. Gender misidentification was a quiet epidemic in early forensics, a ghost in the machine that haunted thousands of cold case files across the country. With the stroke of a pen, Mark Smith was erased from his own remains, and a teenage girl who never existed took his place in the state's records. This error created a catastrophic divergence in the search for the truth. In Billings, Montana, the Smith family was grieving a missing son, a brother who had vanished into the wide-open spaces of the American West. They were looking for a 19-year-old boy with a familiar smile and a traveler's heart. Meanwhile, in Oregon, investigators were scouring their missing persons databases for a runaway girl or a lost daughter. They were 2 ships passing in the night, separated by a clerical error that rendered them invisible to one another. The system was designed to find a girl who didn't exist, which meant it could never find the boy who actually did. The remains were officially designated as the Holcomb Peak Doe. It is a cold, clinical process, the way a human being is transformed into a file number once the initial data is fundamentally flawed. Mark's identity was stripped away, replaced by a cardboard box and a series of standardized forms. The brown sweater and the shirt found at the scene were bagged as evidence belonging to this mysterious girl, and the file was tucked away in a cabinet. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the urgency of the discovery began to fade. Without a name, and with a biological profile that matched no one in the immediate area, the Holcomb Peak Doe became a statistic, a cold case that offered more questions than answers. There is a profound, lingering sadness in the thought of Mark's siblings spending their lives searching for their brother, perhaps even passing through Oregon or looking at the very mountains where he lay, never knowing that the daughter the state was looking for was actually their kin. Every holiday, every birthday, and every milestone was marked by his absence. They lived in a world where Mark was still a 19-year-old boy in a wedding photo, while in a sterile evidence room, his physical reality was being mislabeled and forgotten. The disconnect between the family's hope and the state's record created a vacuum of justice that would persist through 4 decades of silence. As the 1980s gave way to the 90s, and the 90s to the new millennium, the file on the Holcomb Peak Doe gathered dust. Forensic science was evolving, but it hadn't yet reached the point where it could look back and correct the mistakes of the past. The case was a relic of an era of best guesses and manual records. For decades, the Holcomb Peak Doe sat in a box, a ghost without a face, until the dawn of the genomic revolution finally began to cast a new light into the dark corners of the Oregon State Archives. In the fluorescent-lit halls of the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office in 2020, a new generation of investigators began pulling long-ignored files from the archives. The world outside was slowing down, retreating into the quiet of a global pandemic. But inside the laboratory, a technical revolution was reaching its peak. Among the cold cases slated for re-examination was the file for the Holcomb Peak Doe. For 42 years, this case had been defined by a single, foundational assumption: that the remains found in the Oregon brush belonged to a teenage girl. Every search, every comparison to missing persons reports, and every lead followed since 1978 had been filtered through that lens. But as forensic technology advanced from the visual inspections of the 1970s to the molecular precision of the 21st century, the team decided it was time to let the bones speak for themselves once more. Modern forensic scientists now have tools that their predecessors could only dream of, capable of extracting biological truths from the smallest fragments of history. When the team submitted the Holcomb Peak remains for updated DNA profiling, they weren't necessarily expecting a total upheaval of the case. They were simply looking for a more detailed map. However, as the digital readouts began to populate the computer screens, the atmosphere in the lab shifted from routine to shock. The genetic markers didn't align with the records sitting in the dusty manila folder. The biological profile emerging from the sequencer was unmistakable. In a sterile lab in 2020, the chromosomes whispered a truth the 1978 tools were deaf to. The Holcomb Peak Doe was a man. The realization hit the investigative team with the weight of 4 decades of lost time. This wasn't just a minor correction. It was a total demolition of the case's foundation. For 42 years, investigators had been looking at the wrong side of the ledger. They had been searching for missing daughters, sisters, and young women who had vanished in the late 70s, while the true identity of the person on that mountain remained invisible because no one was looking for a son. The female designation had acted like a locked door, keeping the truth safely hidden away from anyone who might have recognized the victim. The immediate ripple effect within the department was a mix of profound hope and a sobering sense of responsibility. They realized that somewhere, likely in a different state or a different database entirely, there was a family of a missing young man who had been waiting for half a century. That family had perhaps seen the news of the girl found at Holcomb Peak back in 1978 and moved on, never imagining it could be their brother or their child. The correction in 2020 meant that the path to the truth had finally been cleared of the debris of past errors. The team felt a surge of anticipation. They weren't just working a cold case anymore. They were correcting a historical wrong. The blue light from the monitors reflected off the scientists' glasses as they began the painstaking process of recategorizing the evidence. The rhythmic beep of the lab processors served as a metronome for this new chapter. They were no longer chasing a ghost girl. They were searching for a man who had been lost twice, once to the wilderness and once to a clerical error. If you are listening to this and finding yourself drifting, stay with the mystery for a moment longer. The most vital piece of the puzzle was about to be uploaded by a stranger. This technical turning point transformed the Holcomb Peak doe from a stagnant file into a living investigation. The team knew that while DNA had given them a gender, it hadn't yet given them a soul. They were standing on the edge of a breakthrough, armed with a corrected biological map, but still lacking the most important coordinate: a name. The gender was corrected, but the name was still missing. To find it, they would need a bridge made of distant cousins and digital code. Would you like me to move on to the next chapter, where we explore how genetic genealogy finally unmasked the face of the man on the mountain? The transition from a simple biological correction to a definitive identity required a specialized kind of alchemy, one that could only be performed by the experts at DNA Labs International. When the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office reached out to them, they weren't just handing over a file. They were handing over a fragmented 50-year-old puzzle. The remains found near Holcomb Peak, a skull and a scapula, had spent decades in storage, and time is rarely kind to genetic material. Moisture, temperature fluctuations, and the simple passage of half a century can degrade DNA into a series of broken, stuttering sequences. Building a genetic profile from such weathered bone is a slow, methodical process that feels more like archaeology than modern medicine. Technicians worked in sterile, quiet environments, carefully extracting the minute amounts of viable material left within the dense structure of the bone. They were looking for a specific type of data, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Unlike the standard DNA testing used in criminal trials, which looks at a small handful of markers to match a suspect to a crime scene, forensic genetic genealogy requires hundreds of thousands of these markers. It is the difference between identifying a car by its license plate and identifying it by every scratch, dent, and speck of paint on the chassis. They weren't just looking for a man. They were looking for a lineage, tracing the invisible threads of DNA that connect us all across time and distance. Once this massive digital map of the Holcomb Peak doe was constructed, the work shifted from the lab to the glowing screens of forensic genealogists. This is where the true waiting game began. Forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG, relies entirely on the power of comparison. The lab-generated profile was uploaded to public databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, platforms where everyday people voluntarily share their genetic information to find distant cousins or explore their heritage. In these databases, the doe's DNA was compared against millions of others, searching for a hit. But a hit in this world rarely means a direct match. Instead, it usually means finding a third or fourth cousin, someone who shares a set of great-great-grandparents with the unidentified person. The years between 2020 and 2025 were defined by a profound, professional patience. While the world outside continued its frantic pace, investigators lived in a silence that few could imagine, checking the databases periodically to see if a new relative had joined the digital tapestry. It is the silent work of genealogists in quiet offices, staring at sprawling family trees that resemble massive interconnected webs. They begin with a distant match and work backward through census records, birth certificates, and old newspaper obituaries to find the most recent common ancestor. From that ancestor, they then build the tree forward again, identifying every branch, every marriage, and every child, searching for a male who disappeared at the right time and in the right place. It is a journey defined by resilience and the steady passage of time. For 5 years, the Holcomb Peak doe remained a digital ghost, a profile waiting for its counterpart. Investigators knew the answer was out there, tucked away in the bloodline of a family who likely had no idea their relative was resting in an Oregon evidence locker. Every time a new kit was uploaded by a curious person looking for their roots, a new door potentially opened for the man from Billings. The investigators often reflected on the weight of this weight. They were holding a secret that belonged to a family who had spent 50 years wondering if their brother, son, or friend was still out there living a life they couldn't see. The science was ready, the profile was stable, and the genealogists were poised. All they needed was a single person, perhaps thousands of miles away, to take a simple cheek swab and wonder about their own history. In September 2025, that exact moment arrived. A new kit was uploaded to a public database, and the invisible threads finally tightened. Somewhere in Montana, a relative had just unknowingly signed Mark Smith's death certificate. The search for the Holcomb Peak doe had always been a game of numbers and microscopic fragments. But in September 2025, it suddenly became a matter of geography. The digital landscape of the public DNA database flickered with a new entry, a significant match that didn't just hint at a distant cousin, but pointed directly to a specific family line rooted in the soil of Billings, Montana. For the genealogists working the case, the sensation was like a sudden clearing of a dense fog. The name Smith began to surface in their research, a common name, certainly, but one attached to a very specific set of circumstances in the mid-1970s. As they traced the branches of this family tree, they noticed a conspicuous absence. There was a son, a brother, who seemed to have simply stopped existing in the public record right around 1974. No marriage licenses, no property deeds, no death certificates in his home state. Just a quiet, 50-year-long silence that seemed to hum with a vibration of its own. The investigators in Oregon, accustomed to the dry clinical work of reviewing forensic files, found themselves staring at a telephone. The distance between Josephine County and Billings, Montana, is roughly 800 miles of open road and rugged mountains, the same terrain that Mark Smith would have crossed on his journey over half a century ago. The call they were about to make would be one of the most significant moments in the entire investigation, a bridging of two separate worlds. On one end was a cold case file filled with black and white photographs and dental charts, and on the other, a living room in Montana where a family had spent 5 decades wondering if their brother was still out there, perhaps living a different life under a different name. The phone rang in Billings, a sound that in any other context would have been mundane, but in the sterile environment of the investigator's office, it felt heavy with the weight of 5 decades. When the call was finally answered, the voice on the other end belonged to one of Mark's aging siblings. Investigators began the conversation with the practiced gentleness required for such a delicate task, asking if they had ever had a brother named Mark who might have traveled west in the mid-70s. There was a long, heavy silence on the line, the kind of silence that suggests a person is suddenly reaching back through a lifetime of memories, pulling forward a face that had been tucked away in the back of their mind. The intake of breath was sharp and audible. Then came the confirmation. Yes, they had a brother. He was 19 years old when he packed his things and left in 1974. He had wanted to see the world, to experience the rugged beauty of the coast and the mountains. But after he crossed the state line, the letters stopped. The phone calls never came. He simply never came back. For the siblings in Montana, that phone call was the collision of a half-century of hope and the cold reality of forensic science. The question that had haunted a Montana dinner table for 50 years was finally answered by a stranger on the other end of a telephone line. They spoke of a young man who was full of life, a teenager who had stood smiling in a suit only months before he vanished. It was here that the investigators first learned about the wedding photo, the last image ever taken of Mark. Remember the wedding photo from the start? Investigators were about to see that photo for the first time, matching the face to the bones. They would see the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, and the specific shape of his jawline, features that the Oregon medical examiner had been trying to reconstruct from fragments for years. The siblings described Mark not as a case number or a set of remains found by a logging crew, but as a person who loved the outdoors, someone who might have found the beauty of Holcomb Peak irresistible. As the conversation continued, the investigators explained the long journey the remains had taken, from the mistaken identity as a young girl in 1978 to the technological breakthroughs of 2025. The family listened in a state of quiet shock, processing the fact that while they were growing older, getting married, and raising families in Montana, Mark had been resting in the quiet soil of a mountain ridge in Oregon. He hadn't just been gone. He had been waiting to be found. The investigators could feel the shift in the atmosphere of the case. It was no longer a puzzle of genetic markers and database hits. It was a story of a lost son. The siblings provided details that no database could hold. The sound of his laugh, his penchant for adventure, and the way their parents had never truly given up hope, even as the years turned into decades. The matches between the DNA kit and the family tree in Billings were incredibly strong, appearing as a near certainty to the genealogists. However, the legal system and the state of Oregon required more than just a strong lead. They required one final, undeniable proof before they could close the box forever and return Mark Smith to the home he had left so long ago. In the first few days of February 2026, a small, unassuming package arrived at a specialized laboratory containing the final biological keys to a half-century of silence. While the genealogical research had pointed with startling accuracy toward the Smith family of Billings, the legal threshold for death investigation requires a direct, one-to-one comparison. This meant that Mark's surviving siblings, who had spent their entire adult lives wondering if their brother was simply living a different life under a different name, had to provide their own DNA. The most precious among them was that September 1973 wedding photo, the last time the family had been whole, smiling together in the Montana sun before the silence took over. The identification of Mark Smith serves as a profound blueprint for what is now possible in the world of forensic science. For over 4 decades, he was simply a number in a file, a Jane Doe who had been misidentified and forgotten in a storage locker. His case is a testament to the Nameless No More movement, a growing effort by genetic genealogists and investigators to ensure that no unidentified remain is ever truly abandoned. There are thousands of others like Mark, individuals resting in unmarked graves or sitting on dusty shelves, whose families are still waiting for a phone call that may feel like it's never coming. Mark's story proves that the passage of time is no longer an unbreakable barrier. With a single drop of DNA and the persistence of those who refuse to let a case go cold, the dead can finally regain their names. When the remains finally arrived back in Montana, it felt as though the very air in Billings had shifted. Mark was no longer a ghost or a missing persons report. He was a young man returning to the soil he had left so long ago. The family chose a final resting place that overlooked the vast plains he loved. During the memorial, there was a sense of peace that had been absent for half a century. The siblings stood together, much older now than the brother they were burying, and shared the words they hadn't been able to say in 1974. They spoke of his kindness, his sense of humor, and the void his absence had left in their hearts. They weren't just mourning a death. They were celebrating the fact that I was no longer lost. The wedding photo can finally be placed beside a headstone, the two halves of a life finally brought together after a half-century apart. It is a visual representation of a circle finally closing. On one side, the vibrant teenager with his whole life ahead of him. On the other, the permanent marker that acknowledges he existed, that he was loved, and that he is finally home. The rugged terrain of Oregon had claimed his physical form, but it could not claim his identity once the world decided to look for him one last time. As the family stood at the graveside, the wind brushed across the Montana grass, a sound so familiar to those who live under these wide skies. They could finally look at the horizon without the nagging pain of uncertainty. The mystery of the highway to Holcomb Peak had been solved, not through a sudden confession or a dramatic witness, but through the slow, steady march of science and the enduring power of family memory. As the sun sets on the story of Mark Smith, we are reminded that no one is truly lost as long as someone is still looking. The light of the Montana evening fades into a soft, golden glow, leaving behind a silence that is no longer heavy with questions, but light with the grace of a long-awaited goodbye. The resolution of a case like this doesn't just happen in a courtroom or a laboratory, but in the quiet, mundane corners of a family home, where a photograph has sat on a mantle for 5 decades. For the Smith family in Billings, Montana, the news that arrived in early 2026 was not a shock that shattered their world, but a soft, steady rain that finally washed away the dust of 1,000 unanswered questions. Mark was no longer a ghost, haunting the highways of the Pacific Northwest. He was a brother, a son, and a young man whose journey had simply reached its natural conclusion. When we think about the passage of 50 years, it is easy to get lost in the sheer scale of the time that has slipped through our fingers. Since 1974, the world has reinvented itself a dozen times over. Technology has leapt from analog tapes to digital clouds, and the very way we identify a human soul has shifted from the shape of a tooth to the microscopic code within our cells. Yet, for Mark's siblings, that half-century was not a series of global events, but a series of birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday afternoons, where one seat at the table remained perpetually, invisibly occupied. They grew older, their own lives unfolding in the big sky country, while Mark remained forever 19, frozen in the grain of a wedding photo, eternally poised to step out into a world that would never let him back. There is a particular kind of peace that comes with total closure. It is different from the high-pitched relief of a rescue or the sharp catharsis of a criminal conviction. It is a resigned calm, a settling of the spirit that allows a family to finally exhale a breath they have been holding since the Ford administration. The identification of the remains at Holcomb Peak provided the most vital piece of the human experience. The ability to say, here is where he was. Here is where the trail ended. Here is where we can finally place a name over the silence. The Oregon woods are vast, and they are indifferent to the stories of the people who wander through them. To the logging crew in 1978, the discovery was a grim anomaly in a day's work. To the investigators in the 1980s and 90s, the Holcomb Peak doe was a filing error, a girl who didn't exist, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. But to the genealogists and the medical examiners of today, it was a debt to be paid to the past. They worked with a quiet, clinical reverence, knowing that every DNA sequence they mapped was a bridge being built back to Montana. As the official reports were finalized and the remains were prepared for their journey back to Billings, the atmosphere surrounding the case shifted from one of investigative tension to one of deep, communal reflection. This was not a story of a monster in the woods, but a story of the fragile thread that connects us to our origins. Mark Smith didn't disappear because of a grand conspiracy or a hidden evil. He was a young man who sought the horizon and found a different kind of eternity in the rugged terrain of Josephine County. The lack of foul play, while perhaps leaving the why of his death to the mountain, provides its own kind of mercy. There is no one to hate, no one to hunt, and no one to blame. There is only the reality of the wilderness and the limits of the human frame. You can imagine the scene in Billings when the sun dips below the rim rocks, casting long blue shadows across the valley. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. In a small cemetery, or perhaps in a private garden, the family can finally gather. They aren't looking for a missing person anymore. They are looking at a headstone that finally bears a name. Mark Smith, 1954 to 1974, found 2026. Those dates represent a life that was short in years, but long in the memory of those who loved him. It is the end of the search, the end of the theorizing, and the beginning of a different kind of remembrance, one that isn't clouded by the fog of mystery. The hikers who pass by Holcomb Peak today might look at the trees and the steep slopes with a new perspective. They might realize that the ground beneath their boots holds the history of those who came before, the seekers and the wanderers who paved the way. Mark Smith is part of that landscape now, but he is no longer a secret kept by the earth. He has been reclaimed by the living, brought back from the edge of the world to the place where his story began. It is a reminder to all of us who listen to these accounts in the dead of night that the truth has a patient, persistent heartbeat. It doesn't matter if 50 years pass or 100. The desire to bring our lost ones home is one of the most powerful forces in the human heart. It drives scientists to work late into the night over glowing screens and drives siblings to keep a DNA kit in a drawer, just in case. That persistence is what finally broke the silence of the Oregon mountains. As you settle deeper into your blankets, let the weight of this resolution settle over you as well. The world can be a vast and confusing place, and sometimes people go missing in the folds of the map. But we are living in an era where the shadows are retreating. The does are regaining their names. The empty chairs are being acknowledged. There is a profound safety in knowing that even after half a century, we do not give up. We keep looking until the highway leads back to the front door. The story of Mark Smith is a testament to the fact that justice isn't always about a gavel. Sometimes justice is simply the truth. It is the restoration of an identity. It is the simple act of a sister being able to say her brother's name without a question mark at the end of it. The mountain has yielded what it took, and the ledger is finally balanced. The mystery of Holcomb Peak has dissolved into the history of a family, a chapter closed with a gentle hand and a heavy heart, but a heart that is finally at rest. The rain continues to fall outside, a steady rhythmic hum that reminds us of the persistence of nature. But inside there is warmth. There is the knowledge that a long-lost son of Montana is no longer sleeping in a box in an evidence room or lying unidentified on a lonely ridge. He is back among the people who remember his laugh, the way he looked in his best suit at a wedding, and the dreams he had before he set out to see what lay beyond the next hill. We can let the case files be closed now. We can let the investigators move on to the next mystery, fueled by the success of this one. And we can let ourselves drift off, knowing that the world is a little bit more whole than it was yesterday. The highway has ended, the mountain has spoken its last secret, and Mark Smith is finally, truly home. Sleep well. If you are still with us, you may find rest in the story of the girl in the iron box, another mystery solved by the passage of time, appearing on your screen now. The silence of the Oregon woods, once a place of deep, unsettling mystery, has transformed into a site of profound historical record. For 52 years, The ground near Holcomb Peak held a secret that seemed destined to be swallowed by the shifting soil and the relentless growth of the Douglas firs. But the earth does not keep such secrets forever, and the passage of time, which so often obscures the truth, in this case, became the very tool that revealed it. It is a strange comfort to realize that even after half a century, the threads of a human life remain tangled in the physical world, waiting for the right moment and the right technology to be pulled straight. Mark Smith's journey did not end in 1974, though his footsteps stopped then. His story continued through the dedicated hands of those who refused to let a nameless set of remains stay nameless, and through the enduring memory of a family in Billings who never truly said goodbye. As we reflect on the resolution of this case, it is worth considering the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Mark's siblings lived through 5 decades of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, always with a shadow in the corner of the room. The brother who went to see the world and simply never sent word back. They grew older, the world changed around them, and the 1970s faded into the distance of history. Yet their connection to Mark remained as vivid as the last photograph taken at that September wedding. That photograph, once a symbol of a life about to begin, eventually became a totem of a life interrupted. Now, that same image can be viewed with a different kind of lens. It is no longer a haunting question mark. It is a memorial to a young man who was loved, who was missed, and who has finally been accounted for. The scientific journey that brought Mark home is a testament to the fact that justice and clarity are rarely swift, but they are often inevitable. From the logging crew's discovery in 1978 to the corrected gender identification in 2020, and finally to the genetic breakthrough in 2025, each step was a victory over the void. The misidentification of the Holcomb Peak doe as a teenage girl for over 40 years serves as a reminder of how easily the truth can be misread when the tools at our disposal are limited. It reminds us that there are likely many other boxes on many other shelves, labeled incorrectly, waiting for a modern eye to see them for what they truly are. The investigators from the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office and the genealogists at DNA Labs International have done more than solve a cold case. They have restored a name to a soul, and in doing so, they have reminded us that no one is ever truly forgotten as long as someone is looking. There is a specific kind of peace that comes with the closing of a file that has been open for 50 years. It is not the loud, triumphant peace of a courtroom verdict, but a soft, heavy peace that settles over a home. In Billings, the air might feel a little lighter tonight. The questions that once kept the Smith family awake, the what-ifs and the where-is-he's, have been replaced by a singular, solid fact. Mark was in Oregon. He was in the mountains. He was where the air is thin and the view is vast. Whether it was a misstep on a trail or a sudden turn in the weather, the how of his passing matters less now than the where of his resting. He is no longer lost in the vastness of the Pacific Northwest. He is located. He is defined. He is Mark. For those of you still awake and listening, perhaps finding a sense of calm in the resolution of this long-forgotten mystery, take a moment to appreciate the stillness around you. The world is full of stories that are currently in their middle phase. The phase of searching, of wondering, and of waiting for the light to break. Mark Smith's story has reached its final chapter, providing a rare sense of total closure in a world that often feels fragmented. It serves as a reminder that even when the trail goes cold for decades, the truth remains patient. It does not evaporate. It only waits. As the rain continues to fall against the glass, and the hum of the night provides a backdrop for your thoughts, consider the sheer scale of the landscape Mark was exploring. The Pacific Northwest is a place of immense beauty and immense indifference. It does not care for the names of those who walk its paths, but it holds on to them nonetheless. Holcomb Peak will always be a part of Mark's story, just as Billings will always be his home. The distance between those 2 points was bridged not by miles, but by the persistent application of human curiosity and forensic skill. It took 50 years to build that bridge, but it stands now, firm and unshakable. The highway has ended, the mountain has spoken its last secret, and Mark Smith is finally, truly, home. Sleep well. If you are still with us, you may find rest in the story of the girl in the iron box, another mystery solved by the passage of time, appearing on your screen now. Listen to the rhythmic patter of the rain. Let it wash away the complexities of the day. The world is a place where things can be found, where lost brothers can be returned to their sisters, where a 19-year-old boy from 1974 can finally find his way back to the family that kept a candle burning for him for half a century. The silence of the mountain is no longer a lonely one. It is a silence of completion. Every name restored is a light turned back on in the darkness. Every case solved is a promise kept to those who are still waiting for their own answers. As you drift further into the quiet hours, let the weight of this resolution settle into your bones. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There are no more questions to answer. The records have been updated, the DNA has been matched, and the story has found its natural end. You are safe, you are warm, and the mysteries of the world are being looked after by those who do not give up. Trust in the process of time, and trust in the silence. Mark is home. The mountain is still, and you are allowed to rest. The steady rhythm of the rain against the window pane is the only sound that remains. It is a constant, soothing presence, much like the memory of those we have lost. It reminds us that even when the world seems vast and overwhelming, there is a rhythm to it all. There is a beginning, a middle, and eventually a peaceful end. Tonight, we have seen that end. We have watched the final pieces of a 50-year puzzle click into place. We have seen the name Mark Smith written back into the book of the living, even if only to say he has passed. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is the piece of the solved case. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. The journey is over.